As the juror roles are simply responsible for voting for entries, it's the admin user's responsibility to then mass jury in or jury out all of the submissions according to the voting thresholds. This mass jury feature will slightly vary depending on how you have your jury settings set up. Notice that when you mass jury all of your submissions, you can always then go and individually override single submissions as needed. So typically the workflow would be you would come to the jury estimator tool and you would punch in values here to determine what the average votes for your jury pool was. So for example, in fine art, I'll put 2, and I'm just going to do a value of 2 for each of these. And you'll see that this then gives me estimates of how many submissions would be juried in if I use the value of 2. So in fine art, it's going to give me 42 submissions, or 6 of the 14 in that category. In illustration, it's only going to give me 1 of 2, which is 50% of that category, for a total of 20 submissions would be juried in out of my entire pool of 29. Now, you can always play with these numbers if you want to get specific numbers in each category or specific percentages in each category. So for example, photography right now with the value of 2 is giving me all 10, but maybe that's too high. I want to get this closer to 50%. So I can simply then come in here and just punch in different numbers to see exactly where I get to. So it looks like a value of 3 is going to give me 5 of 10. And you can be as finite as you want, especially if you have multiple jurors. Remember, their votes are all average. So I can do something like 3.15 to get a very specific number and do breakoffs based on that. Now, if you're not sure what your breakoffs can be, you can always come over to the data and the submissions tab, and you can always filter this column, which is the average vote column, by low or by high. And you can then just kind of scroll down and see where some of the natural breakpoints occur if you're curious by just looking at submissions according to breakpoints. So I can see it looks like there's maybe a break here, and anyway, you can filter that way. So let me come back over here to the jury settings, and the jury estimator tool. So once you have the values that you're happy with for each category, the second step is then to go mass mark them. So I would come here then to the mass jury settings, and I would say, okay, you can either do all categories at once if you just have a single value for all categories, or like I just demonstrated, you can go category by category and do a different threshold per category. So I'll choose the fine art as juried in, where the average jury rating is greater than 2, and this should mark those 6 entries that we saw before. And I'll do the photography the same thing, and I'll hit mark entries, and you can see that does the 10 there. And you would then just go down through each category in the same way. So what I would do here is I would just choose the fine art category. I'm going to jury everything greater than 2 and hit mark entries. And you can see it's going to mark those 6 entries in that category as juried in. Then I would want to jury out everything that's below my threshold. So I would say, okay, fine art, juried out, where everything is lesser than, maybe I'll do 2.01, which is going to include 2 and below would be juried out. Now I'll click mark entries there, and you can see that that actually does 6 additional ones. So let's go double check that. Let's go to our data. We'll go to our submissions tab, and let's just filter by the fine art category. And you can see right here, there's my ones that are juried in and the ones that are juried out. So there just so happens to be 6 and 6 of each. This one didn't get filtered at all. It's still unjuried. It's still pending because it doesn't have any submission votes. So there was nothing for it to jury in or jury out. But all the other ones, I can sort this by the juried column. Let's just sort this like this. So there's all the juried outs, there's all the juried ins, and then there's the 2 that don't have any votes currently. This one doesn't have any votes because it's currently hidden from juror users, so they weren't able to vote on that one in the first place. And this one's the brand new one that doesn't have any votes. So that is kind of how you would go through and do the mark juried status. So you just go category by category, then you go to fine art, and I'd say, okay, maybe I have a different threshold here. So I'm going to say, okay, this one's 3. So I'm going to jury in everything greater than 3. That's going to give me the 5 that we saw earlier. Then I would jury out everything that's lesser than 3.01 and mark all those, and it's going to jury those out as well. So now if we go back to our data and our submissions, we'll see now if we filter to our photography category that we have the juried in and juried out entries. And it just so happens to be it was even split 5 and 5. And there's all the entries. And you can see if I come back to my data and go to, well, actually, let's go to settings and dashboard, you can always see the overall statistics on how things are being juried in and juried out as you're going. So that's kind of the process. You just jury in and then jury out all your entries. So the final resting state of all submissions should either be juried in, juried out, or juried alternate. And that's kind of all you need to worry about. Now, in a little bit more advanced situation, you may want to then move things between rounds and rounds. Rounds are only used as the exception when you have specific jurying use cases where you want to jury things. A few examples are maybe you have a lot of submissions and you have 3 or 4 jurors that are going to do the initial pool, and then you have another set of jurors that are going to do the second pool. So in this instance, I'm going to reset all the submission statuses here back to default, so they're all set to pending. So all those ones that we just juried are now back to default. And let's go ahead and look at that. So right now, if I look at my data, I have lots of submissions and there's lots of different votes from different users. So you can see here that, there's been several jurors that have voted on this submission. They all have different star ratings and several jurors have voted on this. So we have this average value between all of the votes and all of the juror users. So now what I can do is I can then advance things to round 2 and then jury things out that don't make it to round 2. So in my settings, I would come over here to my jury process and go to my mark juried. So in this case, instead of doing it category by category, I'm just going to do all at once for illustration purposes to make it a little bit simpler. So I'm going to jury everything in all categories as advanced to round 2, where the average jury rating is greater than 2.5. Okay? And then let's go ahead and just mark all of those entries. So what that did is it now took 17 submissions and moved them into round 2. Now what I would do is I would jury out everything that didn't make it. So then I would say, okay, all categories, let's jury out where the value is lesser than 2.51 or something like that. And let's jury all those out. And 10 submissions got juried out. So now if we go look at our data, we're going to see, I'm going to sort this by the juried column again. So we're going to see those 10 submissions that weren't above our threshold. You can see the average votes right there. And then we're going to see all the other submissions. They're not juried in, they're just now moved to round 2. So now all these other submissions are in round 2. And now I can go re-jury once I activate round 2. So now I'm going to come over here to my settings, and then you would go to your jury settings. I'm going to go to the jury process, and I'm going to set the jury round to be jury round 2 and click update. Now all of the settings, the marked juried status and everything are only going to affect the submissions that are in the current jury round, which in this case is round 2. And you can see there's only 17 submissions. So when I do all of these commands here, it's not going to work on all those submissions that are juried out because they're not in round 2. It'll only affect the 17 that are in round 2, which is what you want. Now note that when you go in and do your jury, so if I come in here, let's go down to tools, and I'm going to add a new, let's just log in here to a juror user. Let's do this juror user right here. We'll log into this guy. And you can see that he's going to have all these submissions here. And these are only the submissions that are currently in round 2. He's not going to see any of the ones that are juried out. So now he can do a re-jury. So I'm just going to give 5 stars, 4 stars, 3 stars. I'm just going to go down the trail here. So we have some votes that are then in round 2. And so I'm doing my jurying here and voting on all these submissions. And this is what the juror would do, right? Because this is in round 2. Okay, so all of those votes are now voted on. You can see when I go to all my voted submissions, there's all the votes that I voted in round 2. So now let's log back in as the admin user. And let's go back here to the marked juried status. And then you would sort of rinse and repeat, right? So now everything is in round 2, so I can go to my jury estimator tool. And now when I punch in numbers here, I'll just do the number 2 for each of these. Actually, let's do the number 3. So I'll do 3, 3, 3, 3. And these estimates are only for the submissions that are in round 2. And you can see only 5 of all of those have a rating greater than 3. And so if now you're happy with the results and you're ready to mark them as juried in, you'd come to the juried status and say, okay, I'm going to do all categories as juried in where the average rating is greater than 3. And this should only mark those 5 because they're the current ones that are in the current jury round of jury round 2. And I just click Mark Entries. So those 5 entries have now been juried in. And then I will need, again, to jury out everything that's lesser than 3.01 because all the entries that didn't make it need to be marked as juried out. And those 12 submissions are now juried out. So when I go back to my data and submissions, now I can kind of see the same thing. All of my submissions are juried in and juried out. Even the ones that made it to round 2 are juried out, and there's going to be some that made it to round 2, if we go to page 2, that are juried in. And that's kind of just the process. And if you need more jury rounds, you just simply advance those items. Instead of jurying them in, I would say, okay, well, in all categories, I'll just do all categories again. I'm going to advance to round 3. Notice that it automatically puts round 3 because it knows we're currently in round 2. So I would just kind of do the same thing. Maybe I want to advance everything to round 3. And now I'm going to have a smaller pool in round 3 and then re-jury again. Have my jury users log in and jury, and then et cetera, et cetera. So you can do that up to 6 rounds. That would be very rare. Most people would only need 1 round, like we mentioned, and maybe 2 rounds, 3 rounds if you have specific use cases where you're going to be using those advanced jury round features. So that's kind of how the jurying works there with rounds. Now, the last sort of jury technique that I need to show you is if you have clamping turned on. So if you have down in here in your jury user permissions, if for some reason you've set up user clamping, and this again is the exception, there's only 95% of calls will not use this, but for the few who do need it, you can set each juror to be limited to a specific range of submissions. So in this case, I'm going to make this guy, let's give him 1 to 15, and we'll make juror 2 16 to 30. And these values that are in here are automatically placed in there as placeholders because they automatically distribute the submissions evenly between all of your jurors. You can, of course, use whatever number you want, but those numbers are typically what you will use. So I'm going to update that. So now when my juror users log in, they'll be restricted to a specific range of submission IDs. And now when I go mark my juried status, or I look at my jury estimator tool, there's a new option down here called Jury Estimator with category clamping. And the reason why we need this is because if you have specific juror users only looking at a specific range of submissions, they're going to be having very different averaging. So you can't use a general category because the jurors will have different averages. For example, the juror that looks at the first range may average only 1 star, while the juror who looks at the last range may average 4 stars. And so in that case, you can't just jury everything in fine art greater than 3 stars. Otherwise, you're going to essentially eliminate all the first juror's work and jury in all of the last juror's work. So in the case where you're using clamping, you need to be able to see the estimates based on each individual juror's ranges. So I can click on this. Let's look at submissions 1 through 15, and I can say, okay, what's his value that's greater than 2? So for the first range, right, he has 23%, which is 4 of 17. And then I can go look at the last range and punch in maybe 3 and see what percentage that is. It looks like that juror doesn't have any votes. But you would get the idea, right? So then you can get the same number of submissions roughly per juror, and then you would use those numbers when you do your jury in. So if you have clamping enabled and you go to mark juried status, notice that there's a new option here where you can clamp for a specific range. So I can say, okay, all categories I want to mark as juried in where the average jury rating is greater than 2 for the first juror who's jurying those sets, and that may give me 15 submissions. And for the second juror, I need to maybe use 3.5 for this guy, and that's going to give me 15 submissions. Had I used 2, it would have given me, 25 submissions or something, right? So this allows you to then jury in and jury out within a specific range for really, really fine-grained control over how those entries are accepted. But the big takeaway here is the final state of all of your submissions should be either juried in, juried out, or juried pending, juried alternate if you're using alternates. If you need to then, at the very end, manually override any of the ratings, you can always do that, and that's almost always the case. So once you've done the mass jury, that's just a quick way to mass jury all your submissions. You can then always come into a submission and say, oh, whoops, this one got juried out, but for whatever reason, this one needs to be in the show. You can go ahead and click the edit button on that submission and manually update its status to juried in and hit update. And now that submission will be juried in when you are ready to send out your notifications. So you can always do manual overrides, then you'll double check and make sure all your submissions are looking correct according to your jury preferences. Then you're ready to finally send out the notifications. So then you can come to the jury settings and then go to send the jury status, and this will then just mass notify all of the users that will give them their notification status, again, according to the email templates that you've set up. So in the juried in email template, if you're going to be sending that juried in email, make sure you came in here and customized that jury in email. This is your opportunity to provide additional details, right? Here's what you need to do next. You need to drop it off on this date. You need to print this receipt. You need to bring your piece, right? And kind of all those details. That's your opportunity to let those users know. So that is a really quick sort of deep dive into the mark juried status. There's just a couple of options down here that are helpful if you need to kind of reset things if you mess something up. So this mass reset all submission statuses will take all of the juried statuses, whether they're in, out, or pending, and set them back, in, out, or alternate, and set them back to pending. So if I go ahead and select this and hit OK, it's going to reset all of my submissions back to pending. Notice they're still in round 2 and the votes are still all active. All the jury votes are still present. Just the submission status itself is set to pending. So then I can go ahead and redo the status as needed. The other one inside of here is helpful if you're going to accept all of your submissions. So from time to time, a call may accept all entries, and they just need to mass jury everything in. So you can use this mass jury in, and it will jury in every single one of your submissions, even if it doesn't have a vote, even if there's no jury votes. So if I click this and hit OK, you can see it's going to jury in all 29 submissions. So now when I go look at my submissions tab, everything essentially is juried in at this point. And then lastly, the setting there, you probably saw the last one, which is the move submission between rounds. Occasionally you may advance things to round 3 on accident. Maybe you came up here and you said, okay, juried in, and I moved it to round 3, but I really wanted to say juried in. Well, you can always say, okay, take things that are currently in round 3 and move them back to round 2, and that will essentially send everything back to round 2, where then you can go and fix any mistake that you may have made that way.